Imagine controlling more gold than every bank on Earth combined. Imagine being so rich that when you traveled through a foreign city, you accidentally destroyed its economy just by spending your own money. Imagine building universities, mosques, and libraries across an entire continent. Commanding an army of over 200,000 soldiers, ruling an empire so vast it stretched across modern-day nations we still know today. Now imagine all of that, every coin, every palace, every square mile of empire, reduced to rubble, poverty, and dust. Not in centuries, not slowly, but within decades of your death. This is the story of Mansa Musa, the richest human being who has ever walked this earth. A man whose wealth was so incomprehensible that historians have literally refused to put a number on it, and a man whose legacy collapsed so completely that the land he once ruled is now one of the poorest places on the planet. This is not just a story about money, this is a warning. A world before Mansa Musa. To understand how extraordinary Mansa Musa was, you first need to understand the world he was born into. The year is approximately 1280 AD. While Europe is still stumbling through its medieval period, kings fighting over scraps of land, plagues beginning to stir, entire populations living in wooden huts, something very different is happening in West Africa. The Mali Empire is rising. It is an empire built on two of the most precious commodities the ancient world has ever known, gold and salt. Gold was found in abundance across the southern reaches of the empire. Salt, believe it or not, was equally valuable. In a world without refrigeration, salt was the only way to preserve food. It was literally currency. People traded it pound for pound against gold. The Mali Empire sat at the crossroads of both. Trade caravans from Egypt, Morocco, and the Mediterranean would cross the Sahara Desert, one of the most deadly journeys in the ancient world, just to reach Mali's markets. Arab merchants wrote about Mali's cities with the same awe that modern travelers write about New York or Dubai. Timbuktu, one of Mali's great cities, was not a remote desert town. It was one of the most sophisticated intellectual hubs in the world. Its university, the Sankore Madrasa, attracted over 25,000 students. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, rivaling anything in Europe at the time. This was the empire that Mansa Musa was born into, but when he took the throne in 1312, he was not supposed to be king at all. Mansa Musa, whose full name was Musa Keita I, inherited power in an unusual way. The previous ruler, Mansa Abu Bakr II, had done something remarkable and suicidal. Abu Bakr became obsessed with a single question: what lies beyond the Atlantic Ocean? This was 1311. Columbus wouldn't sail until 1492. There were no maps of the New World. Most people didn't even know it existed, but Abu Bakr was determined to find out. He assembled a fleet, not just a few ships, 2,000 canoes. Some say 2,000 boats loaded with men and supplies, and an additional 1,000 filled with gold, food, and water. He handed the throne to Mansa Musa as a caretaker, said, "Hold this for me," and sailed west into the Atlantic. He was never seen again. And so, almost by accident, the man who would become the richest person in all of human history became the ninth Mansa, the ninth king of the Mali Empire. At first, no one could have predicted what was coming. Musa was disciplined. He was a devout Muslim. He believed deeply in education, in justice, and in the duty of a king to his people. Where some rulers hoarded wealth, Musa understood that wealth flows and that it must be directed wisely. Under his rule, the Mali Empire did not just maintain its prosperity, it exploded. He pushed the empire's boundaries further than any previous king. He captured Timbuktu, pulling it back from a rival kingdom and transforming it into a jewel of Islamic civilization. He brought in Arab scholars, architects, and engineers. He built mosques and schools not as political statements, but because he genuinely believed knowledge was as valuable as gold. And all the while, the gold kept coming. The mines in Bambouk and Bore, deep in the empire's southern territory, produced gold at a scale the world had never seen before. Historians estimate that at Mansa Musa's peak, the Mali Empire produced roughly half of the world's entire gold supply, half of all the gold in the world. But it was not until 1324 that the rest of the world finally understood just how rich this man truly was. This was not unusual. Every Muslim who is physically and financially able is required to make the Hajj at least once in their lifetime. What was unusual was how Mansa Musa decided to do it. He did not travel quietly. He did not take a modest retinue. He took an entourage of 60,000 people. Let that sink in. 60,000 people. 12,000 of them were personal servants. He brought his entire royal court, generals, scholars, officials, wives. 500 enslaved men walked before him, each carrying a staff of pure gold. 80 to 100 camels, each carrying anywhere from 50 to 300 pounds of gold dust, marched in a train that stretched across the horizon. He reportedly spent 5 tons of gold on his journey to Mecca. His caravan was so enormous that it took years for news of its passage to reach certain places, and everywhere it went, Mansa Musa gave. He handed out gold to the poor. He gave gifts to foreign dignitaries. He commissioned buildings in cities he passed through. He was so generous that even the gifts he gave to gatekeepers and servants were worth more than those gatekeepers would earn in a lifetime. When the caravan reached Cairo, the Egyptian capital, it was like nothing the city had ever seen. The Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, himself one of the most powerful rulers on earth, came out to receive Mansa Musa. Contemporary accounts describe the Egyptian court being stunned, not just impressed, stunned, speechless at the scale of what they were witnessing. And then Mansa Musa started spending. He bought goods, he gave away gold, he paid for buildings to be constructed. For 12 weeks, his caravan flooded the Egyptian economy with gold. And here is where the story takes its first dark turn. He gave away so much gold that he crashed the Egyptian economy. This is not a metaphor. This is documented economic history. The Arabic historian Al-Umari, writing 12 years after Musa's visit, recorded what happened. Before Musa's arrival, 1 unit of gold, a mithqal, was worth 25 silver dirhams. After Musa left, that same unit of gold was worth less than 22 dirhams, and it didn't recover. For 12 years, the value of gold across Egypt, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East was suppressed. An economics professor today would call it hyperinflation caused by sudden monetary oversupply. Mansa Musa essentially printed too much money, except his money was gold, and it was real, and it broke an entire region's economy for over a decade. He arrived in Mecca, he completed his pilgrimage, and on the way back, something interesting happened. He ran out of money, not because he was poor, not because his empire had failed, but simply because he had given away so much so freely across so many thousands of miles that his caravan's cash reserves were depleted. He had to borrow gold from merchants in Cairo just to fund his journey home. He repaid them, with interest, immediately upon returning to Mali. But that detail, that even the world's richest man could empty his pockets when he gave without limit, is a detail we will return to, because it contains the seed of everything that was about to go wrong.
When Mansa Musa returned from Mecca, he came back not just with stories. He came back with architects. Most famously, he brought with him a Spanish Arab architect from Granada named Abu es Haq es Saheli, sometimes called Al-Sahili. This man would transform the skyline of West Africa. Under Musa's commission, Al-Sahili designed and built mosques across the empire. The Jingwereber Mosque in Timbuktu, which still stands today over 700 years later, is one of them. Its mud brick architecture is so advanced, so beautifully engineered, that it has survived 7 centuries of West African heat, rain, and time. Mansa Musa turned Timbuktu into the intellectual capital of the world. The Sankore University attracted scholars from as far away as Persia and Egypt. Manuscripts on mathematics, medicine, astronomy, Islamic law, and history poured into the city. At its peak, the city's libraries held an estimated 700,000 manuscripts, more books than any European city possessed at the time. Let that be absolutely clear. While Europe was burning books during the Inquisition, an African emperor was building the largest library on earth. Timbuktu became known as the City of Gold. Arab traders called it a paradise, a city where even the slaves owned gold, where merchants grew rich simply by passing through, where a student could receive an education that no European university of the time could match. This was Mansa Musa's empire at its peak, and it is worth pausing here to acknowledge what is still to many people a shocking truth. The richest human being who has ever lived was an African king, not a European industrialist, not an American oil baron, not a Silicon Valley billionaire, a black African emperor from the 14th century. His wealth, adjusted for inflation and modern economic scales, has been estimated at anywhere from $400 billion to literally incomprehensible. Time magazine reported, "There's really no way to put an accurate number on his wealth." Some economists have simply stopped trying. He owned half the world's gold, controlled the world's most important trade routes, commanded a personal army of over 200,000 soldiers, and ruled an empire roughly the size of Western Europe. And then around 1337, Mansa Musa died, and everything, as slowly then very quickly, fell apart. When a great man dies, the first question is always, who comes next? For Mansa Musa, the answer was his son, Mansa Magan, and Mansa Magan was not his father. Historians have been blunt about this. Within just 4 years of Musa's death, the first catastrophe struck. The city of Timbuktu, the jewel, the library, the intellectual crown of the empire, was raided and burned by the Mossy people from the east. Timbuktu burned. This was not just a military defeat, it was a signal that the empire that had once felt invincible was now vulnerable, that the walls had cracks, that the king who had held it all together, through his personality, his authority, his genius for trade and governance, was gone, and no one could replace him. Here's one of the most important lessons in the history of wealth. An empire built around a single person does not outlast that person. Mansa Musa had been the system. He was the trade relationships, the military authority, the diplomatic connections, the religious credibility that held 60,000 people in line. When he walked through Cairo and markets fell silent in awe, that was him, not a policy, not an institution. Him. And when he died, the empire didn't have a system to replace him with. His successors faced challenges on every front. To the east, the Songhai Empire was rising, a rival power that had once been a vassal state of Mali, now sensing weakness and expanding aggressively. To the north, Tuareg nomads began raiding the empire's northern cities. The salt and gold trade, the lifeblood of everything, began to shift as other trade routes opened and new powers emerged. And internally, the empire tore itself apart. Succession crises, civil wars, provinces revolting, sensing that the central authority could no longer enforce its will. The great library of Timbuktu, those 700,000 manuscripts, began to scatter. Scholars fled to safer cities. The intellectual network that Mansa Musa had built began to fray. By the mid-1400s, just over a century after Musa's death, the Mali Empire had lost most of its northern provinces. The Songhai Empire had conquered large portions of what had once been Mali's heartland. The gold trade was now controlled by others. By the early 1600s, the Moroccan Empire had occupied what remained. The empire that had once produced half the world's gold, that had once housed the greatest library in the world, that had once crashed the Egyptian economy just by showing up, was gone. And the land itself, the land where Mansa Musa built his greatest cities, the territory where his empire flourished, the ground beneath which his gold mines ran, that land became one of the poorest regions on earth. The modern nation of Mali, which sits roughly in the geographic heart of where Musa's empire once stood, has an average yearly income today that some economists have compared to the average weekly income in the United States, the richest empire in human history, the poorest nation in the modern world. If there is a more devastating illustration of how completely and totally a fortune can vanish, history has not produced it. Now, this is where most videos about Mansa Musa stop. They tell you the story, they marvel at the wealth, they note the collapse, and they move on. but I want to stay here for a moment because the why matters more than the what. Why did the greatest fortune in human history disappear so completely? Reason one, the wealth was never institutionalized. Mansa Musa's empire ran on gold, but the gold mines were a natural resource, not a system. There were no banks in the modern sense, no financial instruments, no way to store and multiply wealth beyond simply accumulating physical gold. When the trade routes shifted, the gold didn't flow, and there was no financial architecture to compensate. Compare this to the Rockefellers, who institutionalized their oil wealth into trust companies, foundations, and legal structures that continued generating money long after their deaths. Musa's wealth died with him because it had no structure to survive him. Reason two, his pilgrimage made him famous and exposed him. By flooding Cairo with gold, Mansa Musa made the entire medieval world aware of where Africa's gold was coming from. European maps, including the famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, began depicting Mansa Musa sitting on a golden throne, holding a golden orb. It showed explorers exactly where to look. This is not a coincidence. Portugal began exploring the West African coast in the 1400s. The age of exploration, which led to colonization, was partly fueled by the knowledge that there was extraordinary wealth in West Africa. Musa's generosity effectively drew a treasure map for the powers that would eventually help dismantle his empire's legacy. Reason three, generosity without sustainability. Musa gave away gold in a way that was extraordinary and admirable, but giving away half the world's supply without a plan for what comes next is not generosity, it's depletion. He gave his pilgrimage caravans funds so liberally that he had to borrow money to return home. His empire spent magnificently, but did not invest in ways that would create self-sustaining cycles of wealth. Reason four, one man cannot be a system. Perhaps the most important lesson, Musa was a genius, but his empire's success depended almost entirely on his personal capabilities, his relationships, his authority, his vision. He did not build institutions that could outlast him. He did not create a succession structure that would produce another ruler of his caliber. When he died, the empire lost its engine, and nothing had been built to replace it. Mansa Musa was not broke when he died. His empire was not broke when he died, but within a century, everything he built had crumbled. Within 2 centuries, his people were conquered. Within a few more centuries, the land he ruled was impoverished in ways that persist to this very day. That is the tragedy that history whispers, and we refuse to hear. We live in a world obsessed with how much wealth is accumulated. Forbes lists, net worth rankings, billionaire countdowns. We celebrate the size of the fortune. We almost never ask what happens to it after. Mansa Musa is the extreme answer to that question. The richest man who ever lived, the most powerful empire in medieval history, the most magnificent display of generosity the ancient world had ever witnessed. And today, his name is missing from most school textbooks. His empire is a footnote. The land he ruled is listed among the world's most impoverished nations. There is a quote, not from Mansa Musa, but it could have been written for him. Andrew Carnegie, one of history's great industrialists, once said, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." Carnegie meant something very specific by that. He believed wealth should be given back before death, not hoarded. And by that standard, Mansa Musa was perhaps the most honorable rich man in history. He gave freely. He built institutions. He funded knowledge. But history has a crueler verdict. The man who dies rich, and whose riches leave nothing permanent behind, dies just as forgotten. Build wealth that outlasts you. Build systems, not just fortunes. Build something that doesn't depend on you being alive to keep it running. Because history has already shown us, with perfect and devastating clarity, what happens when you don't. The richest empire in history is now the sand. In the end, if this story made you rethink what legacy really means, subscribe, because every week we go deep into the stories that textbooks won't tell you.